The Democratic memo has been released. That's huge news if you know what the hell I'm talking about. And I don't want to assume that everybody does, so I'm going to give you the backstory. Now, I don't know how far back I should go in the backstory. I mean, I was born in 1984 in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Skipping ahead a few years, I eventually started hosting this show. And I'll skip all the way up to a few weeks ago to catch you up, where Republican Congressman Devin Nunes claimed to have a blockbuster memo that would completely discredit Robert Mueller's Trump-Russia investigation. Ultimately, that memo was released, and it ended up being really not a huge deal. But if the allegations made by Devin Nunes were true, we would have supposed abuses of the FISA warrant process. And that includes for FISA warrants for surveillance on people like Carter Page. Devin Nunes alleging those were obtained incorrectly and on the basis of what he claimed was the discredited Christopher Steele dossier. Now, before we get into the Democratic memo, on the basis of the Nunes memo alone, we knew that he lied because we know that the Steele dossier has not been discredited, but rather has been partially corroborated. But okay, this was what Devin Nunes said. We know that Devin Nunes never saw the actual intelligence documents that his memo was supposedly written about. But okay, some of his colleagues supposedly did. So we were led to assume that, I guess, Devin Nunes knew what was in those intelligence documents, even though we don't know that. Then we learned that there is a Democratic memo, and we wonder, will it be released or won't it be released? There's a back and forth for several days or a week. And ultimately, we learned that it would not be released either because Trump didn't want to release it or because it contained too much unredacted classified information. But for whatever reason, we learned it would not be released until this weekend. The Democratic memo response to the Devin Nunes memo has now been released, and it directly refutes every single aspect of the Nunes memo. Now, to be clear, the Democratic memo refutes the Nunes memo, but that doesn't tell us whether either memo tells the truth. The memos disagree, and I'm going to talk more about that later because that's an important part of this. But let's start with what the Democratic memo says. Here are the major highlights. Number one, the Democratic memo denies that the Steele dossier was the basis for the Carter Page investigation. In fact, according to Democrats, the Carter Page investigation started before the FBI received the Steele dossier. And if you believe time to sort of move forward as we have a conventional understanding of it, it would then be impossible for the Steele dossier to be the basis for the investigation into Carter Page. And in fact, the Democratic memo points out that Carter Page has a long history with Russia that warranted investigation and that he had been investigated before. And previously, it alleges that Carter Page also lied in testimony to the two lawmakers about meetings that he had with Russians. So big picture, number one, the Democratic memo says we had many reasons to be investigating Carter Page that had nothing to do with the Steele dossier. And we started that investigation before the FBI started that investigation before they even had the Steele dossier. The Dem memo also argues that the processes that were used to get those FISA warrants were totally on the up and up, both in terms of who approved them and the information that they contained. The Dem memo denies that Christopher Steele was paid by the Department of Justice for the dossier, which is another right-wing talking point that the memo allegedly debunks based on the assertions that it makes. And it actually mentions that there is independent corroboration of elements of the Steele dossier. I believe this hurts Republicans even more than if neither of these memos had been released. And I encourage you to read it for yourself. It's only 10 pages. But the main points are, it says the opposite of what the Nunes memo said. Remember that Nunes himself never saw the intelligence he was supposedly describing in his memo. But more importantly, we now have the first official statement, to the extent that a letter from a Democratic congressman is an official statement, that says information in the Steele dossier has been corroborated outside of that dossier. Now, let me get to the part of which memo do we believe. I've just told you what the Dem memo alleges. Let's all be skeptical news consumers. If you believe neither memo or you at least question both because you recognize that both the Nunes memo and the Democratic memo are both politically motivated memos. Good for you, number one. But then what do we go to? If we can't ascertain the veracity of the memos, since the underlying intelligence is classified or not available to us, what can we do? I would presume that unless we have actual evidence that the FBI acted inappropriately, I would presume we still believe the FBI acted appropriately, right? Because what we have essentially are two political memos, one saying the FBI acted inappropriately without actually supplying us with the information that would confirm that, and then we have a counterpoint memo from Democrats saying the FBI acted completely appropriately. We don't actually have evidence that the FBI acted inappropriately, and thus I think our default still is the FBI is doing an investigation, and they're acting appropriately, and FISA warrants have to be approved, and they're not unilaterally signing off on these things themselves. Now, if you don't believe the Democratic memo, but you believe the Nunes memo, I would just ask you why, right? Why do you believe the Nunes memo, which contained no actual evidence, but just assertions, and Devin Nunes didn't even see the intelligence he claimed to be citing, but then you don't believe the Democratic memo? That doesn't really make sense to me. And further, this has even more intensely backfired for Republicans because the Steele memo is framed as being partially corroborated. And every time I mention this, Pat, you get the online trolls and you get the cottage industry of people who like to just do attack videos on the David Pakman show saying, Pakman is lying that Trump urinated on Russian prostitutes. I never said that that piece of the Russian dossier has been corroborated. But there are many elements that have been, and they relate to Carter Page, they relate to Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, etc. The question I come away with after reading the Democratic memo is if only 10% of the Democratic memo is accurate, why hasn't Carter Page been indicted yet? And that may well be one of the next shoes to drop on this thing. Send me your thoughts. I think it is fascinating how this memo has backfired on Republicans. They release a memo that has very little meat, for lack of going back to the nothing burger motif. And then now, if the Democratic memo is accurate, it looks really, really bad for people like Devin Nunes. Send me your thoughts. You can discuss this and any other topics from today's show on our subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDDIT. Today's program is sponsored in part by Blinkist. The entire idea behind Blinkist and the service they provide is perfect for me. And I assume really great for a lot of people in our audience too. If you watch this show, you know I read a lot of nonfiction books. And Blinkist is an app that takes nonfiction books and it distills the most important points and insights from the book down to a powerful package of information which can be read or listened to in about 15 minutes on your mobile device or tablet. You can zip through books really quickly. I still think it's great to absorb the wisdom of books by reading them slowly and in their entirety. Deep reading is what it's called. But not everybody. I know I don't have the time to read all the nonfiction books that I really want to. So for the ones I can't read, Blinkist is the next best thing. Huge selection. For one low flat rate, you get access to thousands of books. You can switch between text and audio, both online and offline. And you also get personalized recommendations based on books you've already chosen. Join over 4 million people already using Blinkist. It made the iTunes Best Apps of 2017 list. It's free to try, but you can also get a 20% discount on a yearly membership by visiting Blinkist.com/Pakman. If you're watching on YouTube, we've put a link in the description underneath the video. Again, that's Blinkist.com/PAKMAN.